Humanity's values versus American values. Which way to go? On September the 23rd, US President Donald Trump delivered an 1-hour speech to the UN General Assembly, during which he gave himself a big pat on the back, blasted the UN as a failure, criticized European allies on immigration and energy, attacked China's windmills, and called climate change the greatest con job in the world. His remarks were a stark contrast from those delivered by Chinese Premier Qiang. Li hailed the United Nations as the world's quote-unquote most universal, representative and authoritative intergovernmental organization, which plays an irreplaceable key role in global governance. Li said that China is ready to work together with the United Nations and the world for peace and shared security. Who's telling the truth about the world? Given the sea difference between the two major countries in their views and visions, how can we move forward in an inclusive and cooperative manner? What can members do to revitalize the UN to make sure it's still fit for purpose 80 years after its founding? Welcome to The Point with me, Fedyashin, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Washington, D.C. by Anton Fedyashin, Associate Professor of the History Department at American University, Ben Norton, founder and editor-in-chief of the independent media outlet Geopolitical Economy Report, and from Qingdao, East China, by Zhao, Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So what we're going to do, we're going to put the two speeches next to each other and hear some of the major paragraphs and compare them and understand exactly what the differences are and what it means for the world going forward. First of all, let's hear how the two leaders talk about the role of the United Nations. Let's first hear what Chinese Premier Qiang said about this topic.
With an international system centered around the UN and an international order based on international law, human society has realized overall peace and achieved unprecedented levels of development and prosperity.
Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump claimed to have ended 7 wars and criticized the UN, saying that it didn't even try to help. Listen in.
It's too bad that I had to do these things instead of the United Nations doing them. All I got from the United Nations was an escalator that on the way up stopped right in the middle, and then a teleprompter that didn't work. These are the two things I got from the United Nations, a bad escalator and a bad teleprompter.
Well, Anton, let me start with you. Despite the entertaining value, how do you look at the two messages? What's the biggest difference you're hearing?
Well, the two messages are both, how should I put this delicately, readings of reality that is not exactly the way that the two speakers claim it is. Li Qiang was very idealistic about the way that he put the history of the modern world since the UN's been founded, because, of course, the world does not operate with the UN as its center. During the Cold War, the world operated based on a binary system, a bipolar system, where the two superpowers determined how the world unfolded. Unfortunately, it was not the UN. And since the disappearance, the dismantlement of the Soviet Union, it, of course, was the United States and its so-called rule-based order that determined how the world works, not the UN. It would have been great if the UN were actually the center of global affairs, but unfortunately it has been treated by the superpowers during the Cold War and by the United States afterwards more as a platform to promote their own interests. I always find it very hard to really take seriously what Donald Trump says. But he is pursuing an America First policy for which the United Nations is simply a gathering that takes place on its territory. And at least in that, Donald Trump is absolutely honest about his view of the world as America's oyster, even at a time when, by the way, that reality is receding in the rearview mirror for the whole planet.
Ben, what is your view on this? By the way, Premier Li said with an international system centered around the UN and an international order based on international law, human society has realized overall peace and achieved unprecedented levels of development and prosperity. I don't think the Cold War era, when the two major powers kind of camped and opposed each other, that is not forgotten by the Chinese. And yet still, Premier Li gave the United Nations and the international order such a high remark. What do you think is behind this?
Yeah, well, I think the first question you asked, it's very important to provide a clear answer, which is that Trump's speech and Premier Li's speech provide completely different views of the world. One is based on unilateralism and aggression and chaos, frankly, that's Trump's. And one is based on peace, development, and multilateralism. And, I think most countries in the world would share the view expressed by China's Premier Qiang, who emphasized that we need to have the United Nations as a central platform where all countries can have a clear set of rules established by international law, not this arbitrary idea of the rules-based order where the US constantly changes the rules when it serves its interests. We need a clear, objective set of international law, and the United Nations can be the arbiter and the platform by which different states around the world can settle their differences. So I think this is a view that the majority of humanity shares, but what we're seeing today is essentially a conflict between these two views, where the US wants a unipolar world, continuing with unilateral policies in which the United States can do whatever it wants, like, for instance, invade Iraq in 2003 and impose sanctions and unilateral tariffs. And China is saying that this is not actually a rules-based order. There is only one international order that is established by international law, which is centered in the United Nations. Now, in terms of the turbulence we've seen, in fact, if you listen to the full speech by Premier Li, he did emphasize multiple times that there has been turbulence, there have been troubles, there have been conflicts, and he emphasized that the symbolic importance of this year as the 80th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations also is important to underscore, because it's the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism and imperialism in World War II, which China refers to as the World Anti-Fascist War. He, in fact, began his speech talking about the importance of this date. And I think just symbolically, listening to the first minute of each speech, you get this message very clear. Li Qiang began his speech emphasizing the importance of the United Nations and multilateralism. Trump began his speech talking about how the United States is the greatest country ever. He's the greatest leader ever. He's created the greatest economy, which is very questionable. And he even claimed in his speech that he's been right about everything. He boasted, "I've never been wrong about anything." So we see, again, a unipolar view of the world where everything should revolve around one country, and a multilateral view where you want a more multipolar system where all countries have one clear set of rules established by international law, and they can work together for peace and development.
Zhao Hai, I'm sure you have read the whole speech in Chinese in particular. Against this backdrop, why does China give such an important position to the United Nations, given all the imperfections and sometimes inabilities, even helplessness, one would sense when the United Nations is trying to come into a consensus, pass resolutions, let alone implement these resolutions? Why does China still say it's irreplaceable and key in global governance?
Well, first, let me say this. I don't think comparing the two speeches are fair. I think Trump's speech is full of lies, full of distortion, misrepresentation, and full of himself. So to compare his speech to Premier Li Qiang's speech is really not fair to the members of the United Nations. And Premier Li Qiang's speech is quite clear that, as Ben stated, the United Nations was never supposed to be a perfect organization because this is based upon great power consensus. And after World War II, it's rarely a consensus that appears among those five, powers, let alone for the, 193 some countries coming together to agree on anything. So it's really a very precious value and also organization that coming over 80 years to maintain the basic infrastructure, the international law, the rules of the world, and global governance until today without a major war broke out among major powers, particularly nuclear war. So in terms of maintaining peace and stability, globally, even despite there's wars here and there, mostly launched by the United States, the United Nations is really a remarkable organization that persists until today in terms of not just maintaining peace, but supporting prosperity, development, women's rights, championing climate change, and all the really good things in the world. So that's why I think China continue to support the work of the United Nations despite its shortcomings and call upon other nations to come together to support United Nations. And I wanted to mention one thing, that until today, United Nations did not fulfill its full potential. One of the major reasons is the United States refused to pay. The U.S. until today is like $3 billion in shortfall in terms of paying its due. And if the United States taking its responsibility like China and any other countries, there are many more things the UN can do to facilitate peace and prosperity in today's world.
All right. Well, I apologize for those who feel offended that we're putting the two speeches next to each other. I really sincerely do, but we're trying to find some kind of odd order out of no order. Let's put it this way. So how about I continue doing that since we already did try so hard, okay? And around the keyword values, for instance, which is a very important keyword for many world leaders who spoke on that podium. Premier Li said, and I quote here, China actively promotes the common values of humanity and never impose our ways on others, whereas President Trump said, in honor of this momentous anniversary, which is the founding of America he was talking about, I hope that all countries who find inspiration in our example will join us in renewing our commitment values. I believe he meant our commitment and values, and those values really that we hold so dear together. A footnote here, when China talks about common values, China actually means peace, development, equality, justice, democracy, and freedom. This is the official connotation of what China means by common values. So, Anton, again, coming to you, what do you see here, the differences? China emphasizing common values for humanity, of course, in the Chinese perspective, America emphasizing American values.
The question here is who defines those values, always. First of all, different societies have different values, but they can always reach a consensus about where the compromises can be reached. But what you hear about in the UN speeches in general, and this is what I always find refreshing, is that the United States usually loses control over the communication flows. And during the UN, you get from world leaders genuinely different, sometimes incompatible views about how the world should work. And if there is a major fundamental difference that distinguishes what Trump said from what most of the other world leaders or their representatives, foreign ministers, for example, said during the past 3-4 days, it is this view about who determines what the dominant values are. And the consensus from the planet is that this is a give and take. This is a question of consensus, of debate, of disagreements, but ones that are handled through a common platform such as the United Nations. What we heard from Donald Trump, of course, is that it is the United States that sets the values. And this is very much an echo of the way that Donald Trump's generation saw the whole world as their oyster from the end of the Cold War in the 1990s and the 2000s. This was America's famous unipolar moment. Those days are gone. We're living through a period of tectonic geopolitical changes where the United States is no longer the ultimate determinant of what happens on our planet. It's no longer the legislative hegemon that lays down the law for everyone. But Donald Trump certainly doesn't feel that way. But the remarkable thing is that that is not just Donald Trump. His language may be more severe, and his way of behavior more uncouth. But the whole generation that runs the United States right now, and this is a bipartisan issue, still sees the United States as a hegemon, and they're having a very difficult time in readjusting to the rest of the world. I'd like to think that more people in Washington would take what's said at the UN more carefully and listen more attentively, but I think that that is a romantic expectation on my part. The grim realist in me says that the United States will go down fighting as its hegemony is evaporating right now.
Well, rarely the word value appeared in President Trump's speech. This is about one of the a couple of times when he talked about value. And Ben, how do you look at that? Because there are a lot of world leaders who went up on that stage, not just talk about interests, powers, but specifically emphasize value and value ahead of the other two. How do you look at the fundamental differences we are seeing now? Is it because whether we have the same value, whether we prioritize value anymore, or can we agree at all on what value really should be the common value that's pursued by every country and at the United Nations?
Well, this is precisely what the fundamental debate is about, is if you listen to these two speeches back to back, Trump makes it very clear that what he values is dominance, hegemony, power, and unilateralism, unipolarity. The United States being the center of the world, everything revolving around the U.S. This is his whole idea of America first. The U.S. will do whatever it wants. It doesn't care what the consequences are for international law. This is why he's withdrawn the U.S. from numerous UN bodies, including the UN Human Rights Council and UNESCO. He imposed sanctions on numerous international institutions. Now, Premier Qiang's speech emphasized the importance of multilateralism and the platform of the United Nations as a way for countries to work together to resolve differences and to seek peace and development. And if you listen to both of these speeches, there are clear themes that emerge, or values, if you like, that emerge. Trump's themes were, one, the U.S. is the greatest country ever. No country comes close. He's the best leader ever. He's perfect. And his other two main themes were attacking immigration. Immigration is bad. He used this racist rhetoric. He claimed that, for instance, Muslims are trying to impose Sharia law in London, which is completely absurd. And then his other main theme was attacking climate change, climate science, and saying that the U.S. will continue to produce more oil and gas and attacking green energy, blatantly violating the scientific consensus around the world on climate change. Now, if you go to China's speech, to Premier Li's speech, his main themes were the importance of multilateralism and the UN as a platform, and also the pursuit of peace and development. This is something that he reiterated many times, the importance that countries around the world all share this common goal of seeking peace and development, ending poverty, developing their economies. Mm-hmm. And related to that is the very important theme of the history of World War II, not repeating that history. And he also talked about how dangerous the moment is today of growing geopolitical conflict. And in particular, Premier Li mentioned that China opposes hegemonism and it opposes the Cold War mentality. And I think this is the real danger, is that if you listen to Trump's speech, which, by the way, was an hour long, whereas most leaders spoke for between 15 to 20 minutes, Li spoke for 20 minutes, Trump spoke longer by far than any other leader, and his speech actually embodies hegemonism and the Cold War mentality, which is exactly what China and most countries oppose.
It's as if he didn't really mind that where he was speaking to the voters. That's why a lot of comments were saying, are you speaking to your domestic constituents, domestic voters, or voters would be, or are you speaking to the US Congress? But he was speaking to world leaders on this world stage. Zhao Hai, but China, people would ask, so China is talking about values, common values, but exactly what kind of vision does China bring to the world when China is talking about common values? For instance, when China is talking about democracy and freedom, of course it comes after the other things, which is peace, development, equality, justice, and then democracy and freedom. Why do China put things in such order and these keywords?
Well, first of all, China did not impose its own ideas onto other countries. China's proposal is coming from its own experience and also from the mainstream of global communities. So that means if today the majority of the world population, the global south, what are they, pursuing? What's the most important thing in their mind? It's the development. It's the stability, the peace that they want. It's not some very abstract agenda of democracy. Even if talking about democracy without democratization of a global system, it's very easy for the hegemony or an individual country imposing unilateral ideas onto other countries and collapsing their democratic system. So that's why I think in today's world, China wants number one, equality of sovereignty, and also number two, wants increasing the voice of the global south and putting a priority on the development on the agenda of the United Nations. So overall, I think it's very clear for China from its own experience that, if you want to elevate people's living standards, you wanted to build infrastructure, you want to develop its economy, you want to satisfy people's basic needs before you're talking about something else that could be actually appropriated or misled to other purpose for the rich, for the global capital to actually exploit other countries' people and their resources. So I think today, standing before the audience, to the global south, to the United Nations, there's very little voice again talking about the reform of the United Nations, even though the UN General Secretary is talking about that, and that's because many countries in the West do not have the interest to reform the United Nations anymore. And they just want to impose or to steer the United Nations to serve their own purpose. For instance, imposing sanctions on individual countries that they're not agree with. This is not and should not be the direction of the UN that is supposed to represent the majority of the global population. So again, I think Premier Li Qiang's speech is very important to point out not only China's position, but also representing the voice of the whole South.
Yeah, we still have a couple of minutes. I want to play out these two sound bites, which is about international cooperation. Premier Li Qiang recalled how countries with different social systems, histories and cultures rose above their differences during and after the Second World War. Listen in.
They weathered a succession of vicissitudes, such as the Cold War standoff, financial crises, and global pandemics, by staying connected and working together. All this proves a simple yet powerful point. Solidarity lifts everyone up, while division drags all down.
And now listen to President Trump.
The entire globalist concept of asking successful industrialized nations to inflict pain on themselves and radically disrupt their entire societies must be rejected completely and totally, and it must be immediate. That's why in America I withdrew from the fake Paris Climate Accord.
Anton, coming back to you, very different attitude towards cooperation. China calling on different countries to cooperate, whereas the United States think that international cooperation on climate change, for instance, is developing countries ripping off developed ones or developed countries inflicting harm on themselves. How do you look at this difference and what would be the implication going forward?
It's very interesting that the two men that you just played are roughly from the same generation, but it's as if we're listening to two different generations speaking. Premier Li speaks as if he belonged to the generation that went through the Second World War, as in fought in it. And the remarkable thing about the generation of the people who founded the United Nations is that for all of their disagreements, the great powers actually were on the same side during the Second World War. They had a common experience.
Right.
They had a shared experience to which they could always refer in order to work out their differences. Donald Trump is speaking from the point of view of a generation that did not go through the Second World War in terms of actually fighting it. It is a generation that lived and grew up enjoying the benefits of the post-Second World War order and has since started taking it for granted, which is why its emphasis is not on cooperation despite everything. It is on pursuing its own interests.
Okay.
In the case of Donald Trump, it's the interest of the United States. That's what I see as an historian as the fundamental difference between these two approaches.
Yeah, we're running short of time. So Ben, 1 minute to you, and then Mr. Zhao, 1 minute to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, we're in a crossroads today in the world, and clearly there are two different visions of the world for how to go forward. And the vision that is being promoted by China, I think, is shared by most countries on Earth, especially the formerly colonized countries in the global South, that say we need a clear set of rules established by international law. We need a platform where we can all cooperate and settle our differences, which is the United Nations. And we need to work together to resolve climate change, to develop, to end conflict and war, to bring about peace and development. I think this is the only way forward for humanity. It's shared by the majority of humanity. But unfortunately, there's a small handful of countries led by the US that are proposing the opposite. They're proposing the rule of the jungle, might makes right. The most powerful countries can do whatever they want. They can withdraw from international treaties, and they're going to accelerate climate change, which is going to make more conflict around the world. So this is the fundamental crisis in the world today, this conflict between these two views. And this is why I think Premier Li's speech was so important. It's important to lay this all out and show the world that there is an alternative to the chaos and the unilateralism we see today.
Mr. Zhao, what's your view, especially what's going to happen next when the difference is so big, right? And the West especially is not going to say, okay, you have the way. They're going to try to hold on.
Well, I totally agree with the two previous speakers that we're at a crossroad, but I want to emphasize again, this is not a crossroad to two different roads. One leads to abyss. We're staring at an abyss. We're going to fall off. There is no bottom if we go down that road. And we've seen not one, but two global wars because of this kind of difference. History is repeating itself. And as human beings, we should not make the same mistake. And the other road leads to a higher, better civilization that we could share. And if we don't choose that collectively, reaching consensus, then I think this is a very dangerous waters that we're going to walk into.
We're going to keep a close watch on the situation. Very quickly, 30 seconds, Zhao, on the same day of Trump's speech, China announced that as a responsible major developing country, it will not seek any new special and differential treatment in current and future WTO, the World Trade Organization negotiations. What does that mean?
Well, that means China is setting a standard at WTO that China is doing helping the world establish a standard that once you reach a certain level of development, China is voluntarily giving up the SDT so that it can smooth future negotiations between China and developing countries with the developed world. It shows that SDT is still very important for many poor countries in negotiating with the developed country. But once you get industrialized, there should be a graduation phase, and China is agreeing to graduate.
Thank you, Zhao, for that very important interpretation. And we have to leave that there. Many thanks to Anton, Fedyashin, Ben, Norton, and Zhao joining us from different parts of the world for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin.